So as I was just saying, who kind of takes on more of the burden of this excise tax depends on elasticity. And in particular, if demand is more elastic or less inelastic than supply. So let's look at two cases. So demand is less elastic than supply. So maybe that's our case one. Two, demand is more elastic than supply. So let's look at case one just down here, and then if we have room, we'll do case two here, or we'll wipe the board and do it on a new clean board. All right, so case one, demand is more elastic than supply. So we know that elasticity is, it's not quite the slope of the line, but maybe relative elasticities are about the slope of the line. So if demand is less elastic than supply, our demand curve is relatively steep, where our supply curve is relatively flat. So in this case, I would say demand is relatively more inelastic than supply. And so we have this equilibrium quantity P star, Q star, and then we have the equilibrium price P star. So as we talked about a few minutes ago, what an excise tax does is it creates a wedge between buyers and sellers of exactly that tax amount. So let's, for example, look at a tax of $T. We're going to keep it really general here. Before it was $1.50, here it's $T. And notice that we're not even talking about who this excise tax is on, because it doesn't matter if it's on buyers or sellers in terms of the burden of this tax. So remember, the bottom of this tax wedge, so maybe we think of this as a tax wedge. The bottom of this tax wedge is the price that the sellers get for selling their good. But then the top of this tax wedge is the price that the buyers pay. And then we have this new equilibrium quantity, which has gone down because we have a tax, right? It's making it more expensive. So let's look at the difference in prices now. So I think we're going to have to erase the board in a second, so I'm going to start working over here a bit. So the tax burden. So remember, for buyers, we can think of the burden as being the price they pay now minus the price they used to pay. And for sellers, this pen is running out of ink, the burden is what they used to get minus what they get now. And if we look at this graph, we see that the price the sellers actually get hasn't changed very much. But the price that the buyers have to pay has changed a whole lot. So think of it like, wish this pen had a little bit more ink. That area there is the buyer's burden, or the seller's burden, I should say. And this large amount here is the buyer's burden of this tax. So in the case where the demand curve is less elastic or more inelastic, the buyers are going to have more of this tax burden. Have a greater tax burden. So they're paying more of the tax than the sellers are. So the intuition behind this is that since the demand curve is relatively more inelastic, they're less sensitive to price changes, right? Elasticity in terms of demand elasticity or of price is about sensitivity to the own price of that good, right? So here, the demand is less sensitive to changes in price than supply. And so how that's going to come out in this taxes are that regardless of if this tax is on the buyers or the sellers, the buyers are going to end up paying more of this tax. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly erase this bottom part, and then we can think about this second situation. You can probably already kind of guess what's going on here, but let's look at this second situation where the demand curve is more elastic or relatively more elastic than the supply curve. All right, I erased the whole board by mistake, but here's the demand is more elastic than supply, the second possibility. We just looked at when demand is less elastic than supply or more inelastic, and we saw the buyers pay more of this tax. Now we can think about what happens if demand is more elastic. So let's draw out our axes, price and quantity. And so here demand is more elastic. So we're going to draw like a relatively kind of flat demand curve there to capture that relative, low elasticity. They're less sensitive to price. Or sorry, they're more sensitive to price, these buyers, because the demand curve is flat. They're less sensitive, it's really steep, right? And now supply is, let's say, relatively inelastic. So you have a relatively steep supply curve. And here's our equilibrium price and quantity before a tax. And then we have a tax of $T, just really general again, $T. And again, that's creating a wedge between buyers and sellers of exactly that size of that tax in dollars. So we can start off this equilibrium, start moving to the left. And as soon as we get a tax of $T, we can stop. $2, for instance, $1.50. Here's our new equilibrium quantity. The bottom of this tax wedge is the price the sellers get. Again, the top is the price the buyers pay. Now again, we can think about the burden. So the buyers, now they have to pay PB. They only had to pay P star before. So their tax burden is like that distance there. So this is going to be relatively small because the curve is really flat. Where here the sellers are relatively flat compared to the supply curve. The sellers used to get P dollars every time they sold whatever good this is, pizza or whatever. Well, now they only get PS, this bottom of this tax wedge. So this distance here is the burden for the sellers. So in this case, where demand is more elastic than supply, the sellers pay more of the tax burden. So again, now we can kind of see it doesn't matter who the tax is actually put on, whether that's charge a tax for selling the good or charge a tax for buying the good. Who ends up paying how much of this tax depends on the relative elasticities of supply and demand curve. So this is going to be really important when we think about, you hear these things in the news or people kind of just say it. Oh, if they put a tax on gasoline, these companies are just going to pass it along to consumers. What allows them to do that, if it's possible, is going to be about the elasticity of supply and demand. They can only pass a lot of this burden off onto consumers if consumers have a relatively more inelastic demand curve.